August 25th, 1944, just outside Le Mans, France. Midnight. The road is alive with sound. Tires pounding gravel, engines howling in low gear, exhaust fumes mixing with dust and diesel heat in the night air. Headlights are blacked out. Only slit covers allow faint beams to cut through the dark. Convoy after convoy of GMC 66 trucks stretches beyond the horizon. Each one is packed to capacity. Jerry cans, crates of .30 caliber rounds, fuel drums, ration boxes. They don't stop. They don't slow. Every 15 minutes, another 50 trucks roll through, non-stop, day and night. On a hillside miles away, a German reconnaissance team watches with disbelief. This wasn't what they expected. The American front lines had broken through too fast. Their tanks, especially Patton's Third Army, were supposed to outrun their own supply. Fuel should have slowed them, food shortages, mechanical fatigue. But instead, the US front keeps advancing, relentlessly. Not because of tanks, but because of trucks. This wasn't chaos, it was a machine, and its name was the Red Ball Express. In the summer of 1944, Allied forces shattered Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Normandy landings on June 6th had marked the beginning, but it was in late July, during Operation Cobra, that the true breakthrough came. American forces smashed through German lines at St. Lo, and suddenly, the stalemate of hedgerow fighting turned into open pursuit. The German Seventh Army began to collapse. Entire formations disintegrated. What began as a crawl turned into a run across France. At the head of that charge was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commanding the newly activated U.S. Third Army. Patton's reputation was well earned. He moved fast, hit hard, and understood momentum like no other American general. Once his tanks punched through Brittany and into central France, he refused to stop. Town after town fell. German defenders were caught off balance, retreating without orders. Within days, the Third Army was advancing 50 to 80 miles per day. But there was a problem. They were advancing too fast. The Allied invasion had been planned around a slow, methodical push. Supply depots were still clustered in Normandy. Ports like Cherbourg were just beginning to function after sabotage and heavy fighting. Rail lines were damaged or non-existent. Fuel dumps hadn't been relocated. The front lines had surged hundreds of miles ahead of their logistical tail. Each Sherman tank required nearly 1 gallon of fuel per mile. A division could consume tens of thousands of gallons per day. And that didn't include ammunition, food, spare parts, or medical supplies. Trucks, not trains, were now the only way to deliver these essentials. German generals were watching closely. They had long believed that the Allies, especially the Americans, relied on wasteful abundance, that they couldn't fight without massive infrastructure, and that if those lines were stretched thin enough, the advance would grind to a halt. They were partially right. But what they didn't know was that the Americans had a solution already in motion, one of the boldest logistical operations in modern warfare. And it would be run not by generals, but by thousands of truck drivers, many of them black soldiers, racing across France behind the wheel of a convoy that would never sleep. The Red Ball Express wasn't born out of long planning or strategic theory. It was born out of necessity, urgency, and a war machine on the verge of outrunning itself. On August 21st, 1944, under direct orders from General Eisenhower, the Red Ball Express officially began operations. The name came from an old American railroad term. Red Ball routes were used for fast, uninterrupted freight movement. In France, it would mean one thing: a dedicated high-priority military trucking operation to deliver supplies from Normandy depots to Patton's spearheads. The system was staggering in both simplicity and scale. 2 dedicated routes, one way in, one way out, 24 hours a day. Only Red Ball trucks were allowed on those roads. Any other vehicle was to be pulled aside. Supply points stretched from Saint-Lô and Cherbourg to points as far east as Chartres and eventually Verdun. No traffic lights, no stops, no hesitation. Trucks drove in blackout conditions at night, and often with air cover during the day. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day, using over 6,000 trucks manned by 23,000 drivers. These were not rear echelon soldiers. They were frontline enablers, and most of them were African American troops. In 1944, the U.S. military was still segregated. While black soldiers were often denied combat roles, they made up the overwhelming majority of logistics personnel, including the drivers, mechanics, and loaders of the Red Ball Express. These men worked under constant pressure and in hazardous conditions. They faced 20-hour shifts, often with no rest between convoys, German sniper ambushes along rural roads, landmines and booby traps left behind in retreating zones, mechanical breakdowns, often in areas without cover, racist policies and unequal treatment, even while sustaining the very army they served, yet they delivered. Time after time, fuel, ammo, rations, and artillery shells reached Patton's tank columns just in time to keep the pressure on German retreat routes. Sometimes drivers refueled tanks while under fire. Others rigged weapons to their dashboards, turning trucks into rolling fortresses. They weren't just keeping the army alive, they were fueling the front. And the German generals, still mocking the idea of American operational planning, were about to see what happens when an army doesn't stop, because behind Patton's tanks was a road of rolling thunder, and it would not break. The Red Ball Express wasn't about tanks, guns, or high command. It was about logistical flow, and how fast you could move material from point A to point B without failure. The backbone of this flow was the GMC STW 212-ton 6.6 truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half. Reliable, rugged, and capable of carrying 5,000 pounds of cargo, it became the mechanical horse of the Allied push across France. Each one could tow an additional trailer, often stacked with 55-gallon fuel drums. A single convoy might carry enough gasoline to keep an entire armored division rolling for 24 hours. What made this system work wasn't just the truck, it was the network. American engineers laid down markers, assigned timed check-in points, established emergency repair depots, and created a rotating driver schedule to keep wheels turning without pause. Red Ball Express drivers had to complete a round trip of up to 600 miles, sometimes without stopping the engine. If a truck broke down, it was either repaired roadside or pushed aside. The priority wasn't perfection, it was continuity. Fuel trucks, ammo trucks, food carriers, medical supplies, all were given equal urgency. Every delay rippled forward to the front lines. And in that ripple was life or death. This was logistics at the edge of war, a living artery, pumping fuel and fire across a continent that was still burning. General George S. Patton had one obsession in France: momentum. He believed war was a current. If you stopped paddling, you drowned. And once his Third Army broke free from the hedgerows in Normandy, he pushed harder than any Allied commander. Towns like Laval, Le Mans, Reims, and Nancy fell in rapid succession. German units had no time to regroup, but behind every map arrow was a tank. Behind every tank, a supply chain. Patton's success hinged on the Red Ball Express keeping pace. His armored spearheads sometimes ran hours ahead of fuel deliveries. In extreme cases, fuel trucks raced beside tanks, refueling them from moving convoys. To keep Patton moving, the Red Ball system had to hit an impossible mark: deliver everything needed before it was missed. That meant fuel drops coordinated to exact division routes, bridge clearance for vehicles weighing 6 tons or more, traffic control with military police on all major intersections, pre-scheduled road shutdowns to avoid traffic jams in captured towns, and all of this while fighting a war. There were no front lines for the Red Ball Express, only roads, timing, and the sound of rolling engines. It was the silent battle behind Patton's roaring advance. From the German High Command's perspective, logistics were a vulnerability, not a weapon. Their doctrine emphasized speed through concentration of force, not depth of supply. Blitzkrieg, after all, depended on local superiority and quick, overwhelming assaults, not drawn-out campaigns fueled by mass movement. When the Allies broke out from Normandy, many German generals assumed it was unsustainable. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly remarked that the Americans fight with too much gasoline and too little discipline. Others believed the US relied so heavily on material comfort that they couldn't function without it. Railways could be bombed, depots could be shelled, and trucks? They were soft targets, susceptible to mines, mud, and overextension. But the Germans hadn't anticipated the scale or the audacity of the Red Ball Express. They didn't expect thousands of trucks to operate non-stop for weeks. They didn't think the Allies would commit prime manpower, roadways, and fuel just to keep supply lines alive. And they certainly didn't expect drivers, many of whom had never seen combat, to continue running roads under constant threat of ambush, exhaustion, and mechanical failure. By the time German forces realized the US was not slowing down, it was too late. Patton's tanks had already reached the Seine, and the trucks had never stopped. The soldiers who drove the Red Ball Express weren't in the headlines. Their names weren't etched in battle maps, but their contribution was carved into every success of the Allied advance. They were young, many just 18 or 19 years old. Most were black soldiers serving in a segregated military, denied combat roles, but handed the wheel of a machine that would fuel an army. In the face of discrimination, exhaustion, and danger, they stepped up. They drove through enemy fire, over collapsed bridges, through mud and ice, with no air support and often no sleep. They carried no armor, no turrets, just cargo, responsibility, and the knowledge that if they didn't make the drop, someone at the front might die without it. They fixed blown tires with whatever they had. Some mounted machine guns to their cabs. Others drove alone, wounded or bleeding, refusing to stop until the load was delivered. They were not just drivers. They were the lifeblood of the advance. Without them, the tanks stop. The guns fall silent. The advance stalls. But because of them, Patton's blitz rolled on, faster, farther, and deeper than the Germans ever imagined. The French countryside blurred by in streaks of green and smoke. The roads were dry, lined with churned mud and the wreckage of retreating German convoys. Dust rose in clouds behind long American columns, tanks, jeeps, armored half-tracks, and behind them the endless growl of Red Ball Express trucks. Patton's Third Army was advancing so rapidly that Eisenhower's staff began to panic. Divisions were reaching new towns before the intelligence reports did. In just 4 weeks, the Third Army had covered over 400 miles, liberating dozens of towns and capturing thousands of prisoners. Speed had become the new weapon. But speed has a price, and that price was measured in gallons per mile. Patton's staff radioed back to depots in Normandy. Send everything. Every available truck, every jerrycan, every drum of gasoline had to be pushed forward. And so, the Red Ball Express surged. By this point, it had become a machine of its own. Over 1,000 trucks on the road every day, operating 24/7, with 2 12-hour shifts, drivers running 20-hour routes without rest, fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts arriving just hours before they were needed. The logistics tail was stretched tight, like a cable about to snap. But it didn't. On August 29th, Red Ball convoys made their most critical push yet. Patton's armored spearheads were approaching the Meuse River, a natural defensive line the Germans hoped to regroup behind. If he could cross it before they solidified their positions, the German Western Front might unravel completely. Fuel shortages threatened the timetable. Several lead units radioed that they were running on fumes. Convoys were rerouted. Trucks were flagged forward at gunpoint. At one point, gasoline drums were rolled off moving trucks and siphoned directly into tanks already revving for the next push. In the early morning hours, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the west bank of the Meuse. Their tanks were muddy, scarred, and still running. Behind them, Red Ball drivers cheered, honked, and collapsed in the cabs. They had done the impossible. They had caught up to Patton. And now, the Germans, already reeling, had lost their chance to hold the river. Their fallback line was gone, and the road to Germany was beginning to open. As the Meuse River crossings solidified, the implications became clear. There would be no pause. German command had expected a temporary stall. They assumed American momentum would falter once the fuel ran low, once the front lines stretched too thin. But the Shermans kept moving. Artillery kept arriving. Rations were being eaten hours after delivery. Ammo caches replenished just as batteries were going dry, because the Red Ball Express hadn't stopped. In the first 2 weeks of September, the Express was moving more than 12,500 tons of supplies per day. Convoys were operating under near-combat conditions. Bridges were blown and rebuilt within hours. In towns like Verdun, Reims, and Étain, depots sprang up overnight, stacked high with fuel drums, food crates, and artillery shells. When the roads clogged with their own traffic, military police began routing trucks through fields and over makeshift detours. Drivers were ordered to get through or don't come back. Many didn't sleep for 3 days at a time. Some used morphine tablets just to stay alert on the wheel. Every truck that arrived at the front extended the reach of the advance, and Patton knew it. In one message to his corps commanders, he wrote bluntly, "The limit of my advance is the limit of my gasoline." He wasn't being poetic. He was being literal. And Red Ball made sure that limit kept moving forward. German field officers, now scattered and attempting to reassemble shattered divisions, couldn't make sense of it. Their intelligence units had underestimated American reach. Their fuel depots were destroyed. Their armored columns had no supply left. And yet the Americans kept appearing. In towns just abandoned, fresh U.S. tanks rolled in within hours. Roadblocks were overrun before they were even fully constructed. Intercepted radio messages spoke of supply routes running like clockwork. A captured German general later admitted, "We thought they were just throwing men at us. We didn't know they were moving an entire country behind them." That country, or rather the spine of it, was miles of Red Ball trucks, rolling from the beaches of Normandy to the edge of the German border. It wasn't a miracle. It was logistics. And it had become the Allies' greatest weapon. By mid-September 1944, American forces had reached the German frontier. The incredible momentum of Patton's Third Army had carried the Allies from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of the Reich in just 3 months. Towns had fallen, bridges had been crossed, and German defenses were scattered. But even lightning needs fuel. Despite the staggering success of the Red Ball Express, reality began to bite. Roads were overburdened. Bridges began to collapse from overuse. Engines overheated. Trucks wore out. Mechanics worked 18-hour days just to keep the rolling supply line intact. Tire shortages, transmission failures, and exhaustion began to mount. And most critically, the fuel stocks simply couldn't keep pace with the front. On September 22nd, Patton's tanks ran dry just short of the west wall. For the first time since Normandy, the advance paused. The Germans breathed again. But even then, the Red Ball Express kept rolling, hauling winter gear, replacement parts, and artillery shells for the battles to come. Though the operational surge slowed, the logistical apparatus remained intact, constantly pushing forward. Patton later reflected that his momentum was never broken by the enemy, only by the need for fuel. And even that wasn't a failure of logistics. It was simply the limit of what trucks could do when asked to feed an entire war. While the historians would remember the names of battles, Saint-Lô, Chartres, Argentan, Verdun, few would recall the highway between them, carved by the tires of Red Ball Express drivers. But the men at the front remembered. Infantry who had food and blankets in freezing nights. Artillery units who received 105mm shells at dawn. Tankers who watched fuel gauges dip to empty, only to hear the distant growl of a convoy engine in time. The success of the Red Ball wasn't just speed, it was consistency. It turned a continent-sized battlefield into a single continuous line of support. For the Germans, who believed war was won by steel, it was an invisible blow they never recovered from. Because long before the Allies reached Berlin, the war had already been decided by men behind the wheel. When the Red Ball Express officially shut down on November 16, 1944, its mission had been fulfilled. Over the course of 81 days, it had delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies to the front lines. It had operated day and night, without pause, using over 6,000 trucks and nearly 24,000 drivers. It kept 3 Allied field armies moving, and it did so under fire, under strain, and underappreciated. The system that replaced it, a more permanent highway network of depots and layered delivery, would carry the war into Germany. But without the Red Ball's sprint across France, the Allied victory timeline might have looked very different. Patton's blitz would not have reached the Meuse. Bastogne might never have been relieved. The Rhine crossings could have taken months longer. In those narrow, critical weeks after Normandy, when the German army was shattered and reeling, the war's most decisive victories were not decided by tanks, but by trucks. For decades, the stories of the Red Ball Express remained in the shadows of louder battles and larger headlines. Many of its drivers, especially the black soldiers who made up the majority of its manpower, returned home to segregation, silence, and obscurity. But the history remembers them differently now. They were engineers of movement, soldiers of the wheel, unsung builders of victory. Each mile they drove helped redraw the map of Europe. Each gallon they delivered put another enemy retreat in motion. Each truck they kept rolling, battered, smoking, sometimes shot full of holes, was another chapter in the war that couldn't be won without them. They didn't ask for credit, they asked for clearance, and they got through. In war, it's easy to remember the thunder, the tanks rolling forward, the rifles cracking, the flags raised. But beneath it all, beyond the front lines and headlines, there are quieter sounds. The hum of engines in the night, the rattle of fuel drums in the back of a truck, the exhausted breath of a driver steering through darkness. That was the sound of the Red Ball Express. While German generals obsessed over guns and armor, they forgot the one thing they couldn't outfight: movement. They underestimated an army that could turn roads into rivers of steel, drivers into lifelines, and gasoline into speed. Patton's blitz wasn't fueled by aggression alone. It was fueled by coordination, discipline, and the relentless grind of men who kept driving when everything else said stop. The Red Ball Express didn't make history by storming a beach or capturing a city. It made history by delivering again and again, mile after mile, through fatigue, fire, and fog. And in the end, it wasn't laughter from German generals that echoed across France. It was the sound of trucks,